What does it mean to believe and yet do nothing? In times of moral collapse when evil marches in broad daylight, what becomes of those who claim to follow truth but remain silent? Can faith still be called faith if it costs nothing, if it demands nothing? This is not a question for the distant past. It is a question for now. For every comfortable soul who kneels in prayer but not in protest, who speaks of justice but never confronts injustice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian, pastor, and resistance fighter, lived this question to its most brutal end. While others prayed for peace behind closed church doors, he stepped into danger. He did not speak of faith as theory, he lived it as risk. And in doing so, he gave voice to a radical idea. Faith that does not act is not faith, it is betrayal. This is the truth that haunted Bonhoeffer, and it is the truth that should haunt us. Because in a world saturated with words, gestures, and signals of belief, we have rarely asked what belief truly demands. In the following minutes, we will not simply explore the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we will confront it. We will follow his journey through the collapse of the German church, into the shadows of the Nazi regime, into prison, and finally to the gallows, all driven by a single, agonizing conviction: to believe in God is to act in the world. Or it is nothing at all. Bonhoeffer saw it long before the world would catch up. Not all lies come from tyrants. Some are whispered from pulpits. He called it cheap grace, a grace that forgives without repentance, that baptizes without transformation, that comforts without calling, a grace that demands nothing and therefore gives nothing. Cheap grace, Bonhoeffer wrote, is the enemy of the church. It is the religion of spectators, those who cheer for Christ but will not carry his cross. It is the faith of institutions that bend to power while still quoting Scripture. It is belief turned into ritual, safe, sterile, and utterly disconnected from the wounded world outside. Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves, Bonhoeffer warned. It's the kind that justifies sin but never transforms the sinner, the kind that fills pews but empties hearts, the kind that quotes Jesus but never imitates him. This wasn't a theological abstraction for Bonhoeffer. He watched as the German church, once a moral compass, bowed its head to Hitler, traded truth for security, and baptized nationalism in the name of Christ. He understood faith that refuses to resist evil has already surrendered to it. Cheap grace anesthetizes. It keeps believers docile, respectable, non-threatening. But Bonhoeffer knew there could be no true Christianity without confrontation, no following Christ without stepping into danger, no salvation without obedience. In a time when the world cried out for moral clarity, the church offered moral convenience. And Bonhoeffer would not stand for it, because for him, grace was never supposed to be cheap. It was meant to be costly. If cheap grace is the poison, costly grace is the cure. Bonhoeffer's theology stood as a rebuke, not just to a compromised church, but to every comfortable believer who imagined that following Christ required nothing more than agreement. Costly grace, he wrote, is the gospel which must be sought again and again. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. This grace is not handed out like a free pass. It is not an escape from suffering. It is an invitation into it. Costly grace calls a man to follow, not in word, but in blood. It does not promise safety. It promises truth. And the price of truth is always high. This was the grace that found Bonhoeffer, not in the quiet sanctuaries of theology, but in the noise of injustice, the roar of propaganda, and the silence of those who knew better. It called him not to withdraw, but to walk straight into the fire. For Bonhoeffer, the Christian life was not defined by belief, but by obedience. And obedience was not a feeling, it was a decision, a defiant act in the face of conformity, cowardice, and complicity. This is why his theology could not be tamed, because it demanded that you choose, will you carry the cross, or will you wear it as decoration? Costly grace does not allow you to blend in. It exposes you. It puts you at odds with the culture, the state, and often your own community. It forces you to confront evil, even when doing so makes you the enemy. Bonhoeffer accepted this because to him there was only one thing more dangerous than suffering for righteousness, remaining silent in the face of it. The German church had become a shadow of itself. Sanctuaries stood full, rituals continued, sermons were preached, but the truth had vanished. In the 1930s, as Hitler consolidated power, most churches in Germany chose survival over conviction. They aligned with the regime, baptized its ideology, and watched in silence as their Jewish neighbors were targeted and erased. The cross was no longer a symbol of sacrifice. It had become a stamp of state approval. Bonhoeffer saw it clearly. When the church weds itself to power, it ceases to be the church. And so, he chose defiance. Together with a handful of pastors and theologians, he helped form the Confessing Church, a resistance movement within the church itself. Its purpose was simple, radical, and dangerous: to confess Christ alone as Lord, to reject the idolatry of nationalism, to stand against any authority that denied the gospel's demand for justice. This was not protest for the sake of politics. It was faith refusing to be used. The Confessing Church published declarations. It trained pastors outside of Nazi-approved seminaries, and it drew a line, a theological, moral, and public line between the gospel and the regime. Bonhoeffer took his stand not in abstract debate, but in action. He began training young ministers in secret. He denounced the persecution of Jews, not as a political problem, but as a Christian one. And he did what the official church would not. He said no. No to a gospel emptied of justice. No to a church that blessed oppression. No to the spiritual cowardice that cloaked itself in neutrality. Because in Bonhoeffer's eyes, neutrality in the face of evil was itself evil. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil, he would later write. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. This was not mere theology, it was a declaration of war, not with weapons, but with conscience. And in Nazi Germany, that kind of faith was dangerous, because it could not be controlled. At what point does silence become sin? Bonhoeffer asked himself this question, not from the safety of a seminary, but from the depths of a collapsing world, where sermons no longer reached the streets, and evil no longer hid in shadows. The deeper he walked into the reality of the Nazi regime, the clearer his conscience became. Words were not enough. Theology was not enough. Belief without action was complicity. So he crossed a line most would never dare. He joined a conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. The decision was not made lightly. Bonhoeffer had long preached peace, justice, and the sanctity of life. And yet now he found himself entangled in a plot to end a life in order to save countless others. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a brutal reckoning with a moral paradox. To do nothing was to allow genocide. To act was to abandon innocence. Bonhoeffer chose guilt over purity. He knew he would stand condemned in the eyes of men, and perhaps even in the eyes of history. But he believed that discipleship meant bearing the burden of the world, not escaping it. He became a courier for the German resistance, using his travels under false pretenses to pass messages, aid conspirators, and protect Jewish lives. Eventually, the Gestapo uncovered his involvement. He was arrested, imprisoned, interrogated. And yet he never denied what he had done, because in his heart, obedience to God required resistance to evil, no matter the cost. This was not theology from a desk. This was belief that bled. To many, Bonhoeffer's actions seemed like a betrayal of Christian ethics, but to him, they were the most honest expression of it. We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice, he wrote. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself, even if that spoke was sharpened by violence, even if it shattered his reputation, even if it led to his death. Because Bonhoeffer understood a terrifying truth. Sometimes the only way to honor faith is to betray the systems that have weaponized it. Bonhoeffer once stood behind a pulpit. Now he sat behind bars. In 1943, arrested and imprisoned by the Gestapo, he entered a new kind of silence. Not the silence of complicity, Cohen, but the silence of isolation, of waiting, of deep internal reckoning. Yet it was here, in a Nazi prison cell, that his most radical theological transformation unfolded. He began writing letters, not just to loved ones, but to the future. And in these letters, a new vision of Christianity emerged. One stripped of rituals, stripped of power, stripped of everything but the raw presence of God. He called it religionless Christianity. Bonhoeffer began to see that Christianity had become entangled in structures, institutions, dogmas, traditions that had failed the world in its darkest hour. The church, he realized, had grown addicted to safety and influence. It had learned how to speak within its own walls, but forgotten how to suffer with the world. In this stripped-down space, Bonhoeffer saw something clearer. God is not found in religion. God is found in weakness, in suffering, in solidarity with the oppressed. He no longer believed in a God who simply explained things. He believed in a God who participates in our pain. In prison, Bonhoeffer asked deeper questions than ever before. What does it mean to believe in a God who does not intervene? What kind of faith survives when every pillar of comfort is taken away? And yet, he did not lose his faith. He refined it into something dangerous, beautiful, and unshakable. He saw that belief was not about being right. It was about being with the marginalized, with the crushed, with those left behind by history's march. He rejected the sanitized faith of empire. He longed for a discipleship that could walk into death and still bear witness to hope. Bonhoeffer's letters from prison became more than theology. They became prophecy, not of escapes but of confrontation, not of dogma, but of incarnation, because for Bonhoeffer, God was not far away. God was in the cell next to him. It was early morning, April 9th, 1945. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was led out of his prison cell at Flossenbürg concentration camp. Stripped of dignity, stripped of title, stripped of everything the world uses to define a man. What remained was faith, naked, unshakable, and final. The execution was swift. A few weeks later, the camp would be liberated. But for Bonhoeffer, liberation was not delayed. It had already taken place in the surrender of his life to a higher calling. His final words, spoken to a fellow prisoner, were simple. "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't martyrdom theater. It was the quiet conviction of a man who had counted the cost and paid it. Bonhoeffer's death was not a tragedy of politics, but a sermon of obedience. He died not as a symbol of resistance, but as a witness to the gospel he preached, a gospel that calls us not to comfort, but to the cross. For all his brilliance, he left behind no grand institution, no movement in his name. What he left was harder to measure, but infinitely more powerful. The testimony of a life where belief and action were never separated. In a world saturated with performative faith, Bonhoeffer's life remains an interruption, a stubborn reminder that true discipleship does not adapt to evil. It defies it. He proved that theology is not what we say in moments of peace, but what we choose in moments of danger. His final sermon was not spoken from a pulpit. It was lived with trembling hands and steady heart on the gallows, a sermon without words, a sermon the world could not ignore. Bonhoeffer is dead, but his question is not. It echoes louder than ever in a world where faith is easy and action is rare, where churches preach boldness but avoid controversy, where believers speak of love but ignore injustice, where the name of Christ is used to bless the very systems he would have overturned. We wear crosses, but do we carry them? We recite verses, but do we live them? Bonhoeffer's legacy doesn't allow us to hide behind tradition, denomination, or ritual. It breaks through all of it to ask one thing: does your faith move you, or does it merely reassure you? We now live in an age of curated spirituality, belief designed for comfort, community, and control. But Bonhoeffer's message cuts through the noise. Faith is not meant to be safe. Grace is not meant to be cheap. Christianity is not meant to make you fit in. He didn't die because he was political. He died because he refused to be passive. And if his theology confronts us today, it is because the temptations he faced still remain. The temptation to adapt, the temptation to look away, the temptation to do nothing and call it faith. Bonhoeffer didn't just warn us, he showed us what it costs to believe with integrity. And the question now turns to us, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. What is the cost of your discipleship? If your faith never offends, never sacrifices, never stands in defiance, is it faith at all? Bonhoeffer once wrote, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Not always a physical death, but the death of comfort, the death of neutrality, the death of a life lived safely behind belief without burden." In a world obsessed with convenience, speed, and self-preservation, Bonhoeffer's life is an affront, because it insists that truth demands risk, that conviction demands cost, and that faith, real faith, cannot survive in silence. He did not die simply to oppose Hitler. He died because he believed that to follow Christ meant confronting every lie, every idol, every power that tried to replace God with fear. His life confronts our generation with a terrifying clarity. Faith is not what you believe in your heart. It is what you're willing to lose for in your life. Bonhoeffer gave up his position, his safety, his freedom, and finally, his life. And yet, he never sounded defeated, because he had already made peace with the cost. His writings do not plead for pity. They call for courage. The courage to ask hard questions, the courage to resist cheap answers, the courage to believe not quietly, but dangerously. And so we are left with a choice, not to admire Bonhoeffer, but to follow the Christ he followed, not to quote him, but to embody what he lived. Because if the church today is to matter, if our faith is to mean anything, it will not be because of what we profess. It will be because of what we do when the moment demands action. The time for passive belief is over. The cross still calls, the world still burns. And faith, real faith, still demands everything.